Here.
Councilmember Edelstedt.
Here.
Councilmember Yashewski.
Here.
Councilmember Batcher.
Here.
All members are here. Also in attendance on my left is Interim City Administrator Laura Elverbach, and on my right is City Attorney Arneson. With us in the audience this evening, Arlington resident Tim Berger, Tim Olson from Bolton and Mink, Gary Wires from David Drown Associates, Tom Olinger, Abdul Eichen Myers, and Kurt Mink with the Arlington Enterprise. Welcome all. With that out of the way, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda and any agenda item or any agenda additions. Are there any additions? Hearing none, motion is in order.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as is.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Yashewski, second by Councilmember Highland to approve the agenda as presented. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion is carried. First part of the agenda is the consent agenda. We'll move right into that. It's item 4. And item 4A would be the approval of the August 21st regular meeting minutes. Item B, approval of the August 3rd Joint City Council Planning and Zoning Committee work session minutes. Item C, approval of the bills. Item D, approval of the participation in Salvation Army's Heat Share program. Item E, accept a notice of resignation effective September 6, 2017 from Trevor Latsky, maintenance worker. And lastly, item F, accept notice of resignation effective September 14th, 2017 for Jordan Voigt, police officer. That is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Cowell, second by Councilmember Batcher to approve the consent agenda as read. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No. I don't want them to resign.
Motion is carried, 4-1 vote. There are no public hearings this evening. We'll move into item 5, addressing the council. Mr. Berger, you wish to address the council at this time?
Yeah.
Would you come forward, please, and use a microphone and state your name and address? Make sure it's on there.
Good evening. My name is Timothy Berger. I live at 103 Northwest 4th Avenue, Arlington here.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
The reason why I'm here is 2 Saturday nights in a row, I can't hear my television when it's on loud as it goes because of the stock car racing. And there is a law that disturbing your peace, there's a fine for it. No matter if I took my muffler off the car, I'd be fined right now driving down the thing. And I'm gotten to the point where if you ain't gonna do anything about it, you're gonna find yourself in court. That's the bottom line. That's all I got to say
Okay.
on it things. I'm just addressing you and you can handle it the way you want. And if it's not handled, they can put special mufflers on the cars and have just as much fun running around. I'm not condemning the racing. It's just the noise.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
What time?
It starts right in the evening. So that
No.
last Saturday night at church, it was before church was out. They were running out there, and it was really hard for the Catholic Church service. And this was
It was
at-
not. I was at church and I did not.
They were
hear the
there. I
racing.
could hear it myself, Jim. I could hear it at my apartment, and I had my television on wide open and couldn't leave. I had to leave and go down to the south end of town to watch the program I wanted to watch. So don't give me it.
I was wondering how late the noise
They were
lasted.
done at 10 o'clock. They were
Okay.
done at 10.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that's part of our ordinance, right, is 10 o'clock noise or something?
11 o'clock.
11 o'clock noise?
I believe the ordinance states they can't start after 11 o'clock and the races have to be done by 11:20.
Right.
It's the noise issue that's going to be
Okay.
taken care of. If it's not, you're going to go to court on the disturbing the peace issue. That's all I got to say.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mr. Berger.
everyone.
Okay, move into item 6, announcements.
All right, just, we have a couple, and The farmer's market, you only get to hear a few more times, because we're getting near the end of that season, so, there's a couple more days that the farmer's market will be taking place in the parking lot. Also, I believe you all received notice that the League of Minnesota Cities regional meetings are taking place in September. There are, I believe, 1 or 2 in October, but they're not as close. So I included the link. If you have any interest in attending, I'd obviously highly recommend it. They're good programs. They've got some special workshops that they're going to be trying at the different locations, depending on which location you go to. So if you are interested or you need more information, please let me know. The tree planting, we will be conducting that on September 30th at 10 o'clock. The kind of the starting point location is yet to be determined. The bulk of the trees are going to be planted along our new street and utility reconstruction project. So we do have some incentive to get that to a point where trees can be planted. We have had Bolton and Mink involved as well as Kirby, so they're coordinating on that. We are looking for volunteers to assist with the planting. It will be very simple compared to what some people think of planting. The holes will be pre-dug, so that will be taken care of. The trees will be there. They'll have mulch. There will be some individuals from the tree trust present to provide some assistance and guidance. We have started promoting that via Facebook, the newsletter, as well as last Friday when Rob took around the construction update, we included a brochure, kind of an information piece on that event. So we're hoping to have some of the actual land property owners participate in that and get some advice on how to water it and stuff, because we would hope that they'll be able to take the lead on that, not only from a resource level for the city, but also we get it, the grant that we got the money with is really looking at citizen participation, and so if we can get the citizens involved even in the watering, that helps. And then the Ambulance Association's 25th annual harvest event is coming up on September 15th from 4 to 8 right here at the community center. All that information has been enclosed as well as it's being distributed within the community.
Okay, any questions on the announcements? Move right on to communications.
Included in the packet, you do have the water wastewater report as well as the building permit report. So it's written there for your review.
Any questions on either one of those? Okay, we'll move on to unfinished business. Item number 8, High Island Creek floodplain mapping. Tim Olson from Bolton and Mink, would you care to step up to the microphone? I know this is something that we brought up at the last meeting, and there were some questions and concerns, and we wanted to get the expert in to address those.
Absolutely, I'm
Welcome.
happy to answer any questions.
Welcome.
So mapping, does it have to be done every so often, or how complete does it have to be done? Is it the city's responsibility to do it?
Yeah.
And what's in it for the property owners? How do they?
Those are all great questions.
So
Yeah,
an overview maybe?
I think that we're at a point in the industry where the data is about as high a resolution as we're gonna get. Now, that doesn't mean that things won't be updated over time based on risk. So this whole thing is really based on the risk to the residents that live directly adjacent to the creek. And that can go both ways. So if a resident is currently mapped in the floodplain and they shouldn't be, then they should be removed because they're paying for flood insurance that they maybe don't need per se. It also goes the other way too, where a resident may not be mapped in the flood at risk and deserves to know and understand what that level of risk is. It especially becomes important when somebody tries to go to sell their home and maybe they should have been paying flood insurance and they aren't currently paying flood insurance. It makes it much more difficult to refinance a mortgage or to sell the home as well. So this whole project, our initial look at the floodplain started with a resident that was in question that was going to construct a home right in the floodplain, and they were required to determine the base flood elevation right there at their property. And in doing so and looking at the map versus current topographic conditions and the locations of the culvert crossings and bridge crossings along High Island Creek, we noticed that there were some discrepancies between what FEMA has determined as the risk along High Island Creek versus what potentially could really be there. And that just kind of comes from experience and seeing where the floodplain boundary, how it behaves along those contour lines, and the fact that the culvert crossings really aren't even being taken into consideration along High Island Creek, and that was pretty typical back in the 70s when these maps were created. I think there was a revision in the 80s or 90s, but not to the current standard. So FEMA will kind of dictate, based on level of risk, whether or not these areas will be remapped on FEMA's dime. And in this case, they did not remap High Island Creek with the latest revisions, nationwide revisions. And unfortunately, some of those revisions are based on population. And so Middle America, where we don't have as high a population density, we end up being kind of flyover country, unfortunately. And I truly believe that everybody deserves to know what their risk is when it comes to flooding. So to address your question regarding the city's responsibility, the city of Arlington is active in the National Flood Insurance Program, and that is evident by the fact that you're mapped, that you're mapped in general. By being mapped, you're participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. What that allows your residents access to is federally subsidized insurance rates, so dramatically lower insurance rates for homes that are mapped inside the floodplain. The offset to that is that homes that are mapped have to pay flood insurance.
Right.
There is no choice, but everybody in town, everybody in the participating community has access to the federally subsidized rates. So some of the questions that we've heard over the past several weeks, does everybody have access to those rates? And the answer to that is yes. If we remap the floodplain and we bring new people in, are they required to pay flood insurance? And the answer to that is yes. And if there are people that were mapped and they get pulled out, do they have to pay flood insurance anymore? And the answer to that is no, they don't have to pay flood insurance anymore, at least not mandated by FEMA. But the bigger picture, kind of the global look at this whole thing is really understanding risk. And to me, I can't put a value or designate higher value to a higher population density area because I believe everybody deserves to know what their risk is. So does that answer some of your questions? I mean, I can go into much more detail too if you'd like, but
No, that helped a lot, I guess.
Okay.
My other question, when you brought up FEMA and them doing the mapping,
yeah.
have we asked them to do the mapping in recent months or weeks?
No, we have not. If we were to have FEMA do the mapping, it will not be to the level of detail that we're proposing. In fact, the product will likely be something very similar to what's there now. FEMA uses, without having structures, culvert crossings and bridges, without having those surveyed, they will just assume that either the crossing is completely plugged or it's to some width, or they will assume that the base flood elevation is, say, 2 feet above the lowest overtopping elevation. So the floodplain map ends up being very conservative from an elevation perspective. The product will be a floodplain delineation that follows the contour lines, but will likely be very conservative. So if we can go out and survey those crossings, understand how big the bridge openings are, understand how big the culvert crossings are, and then understand how much floodwater can actually be conveyed through those crossings, you will have a much higher resolution, much more accurate floodplain. So there's some, I hate to use the word risk again in this context, but there's some risk by having FEMA use a very low resolution or low detail type model, if that makes sense. So that would be an option to make that request. That's also assuming that they will do it. Based on level of risk is how they determine which counties get remapped. And then certain areas within the county, based on risk, they will, receive updated maps.
Is it typically a county that they would do at a time, more so than a city, or?
Typically, yes.
Okay.
Typically, yes. Yep. If there's a community that's currently not in the National Flood Insurance Program, and FEMA believes that there is risk there substantial enough that the residents should know about it, then they will map that community and request that they be brought into the National Flood Insurance Program. But it's typically county to county. Yeah. There's a handful of them in Minnesota that we're not going to be updated. We happen to be in one.
I understand there was a residence on Creekview Lane that was purchased maybe a year or two ago, and they were designated as a flood in the floodplain, and the finance company required that they have flood insurance. Well, they did whatever investigating they had to do, resurveyed, and they were removed from the floodplain.
Yep.
One of the questions we had last meeting was on the cost of insurance. Saturday night, I happened to run into Bill Lensing. I didn't hurt him real bad, but kind of asked him about insurance, and of course, off the top, he said it could be very expensive. Wasn't exactly sure. Today I called Mark Lindstrom with State Farm, and he said, picking a number, he said it could be right around, if you had to buy flood insurance, it'd be around $2,000 plus or minus $500 over and above what you pay for your regular insurance already. If you're not necessarily in the floodplain, but you're concerned about it, you can buy additional flood insurance. And he said that all depends on the amount of coverage that you're looking for. And he said that would run around $500, give or take a little bit. He lives on Marion, and at the last heavy rainfall a few years ago, he said the water was knocking on his back door, and he was a little nervous about it. So
Sure.
he was pretty sure he was going to buy the insurance, the extra $400 or $500 insurance.
Okay.
He said if we wanted to have better numbers, that he would do some models to work it up if we needed to know any more about it.
When I think for his home, that $500 is probably is an expensive home. So I mean, if you look at homes that maybe aren't as substantial as his, might not cost for that extra
Well,
insurance.
the extra insurance is based on, do you want $20,000, $50,000,
Oh,
$100,000 worth of coverage?
Okay.
You know, how bad would the damage be if water got in your basement? I suppose that
Right.
would be.
Tim, this all started when, based on the one property that's in question now that needs to do some floodplain determination there or whatever. What if the city just says, we don't want to get involved, just let them do their own thing? Can you sort of tell us in general terms what that means? I mean, is it?
Yeah, the residents have a couple different options. They can have FEMA determine their base flood elevation, and so everything's contingent kind of on that base flood elevation. They can establish their lowest opening in their house or their lowest floor on that base flood elevation. If FEMA determines that base flood elevation, typically what they'll do is they'll look at the structure. So East Brooks, they'll look at that crossing, and they'll say, what is the minimum overtop elevation there? They'll look at the next downstream crossing too and say, what is the minimum overtopping elevation there? And they'll set a very conservative base flood elevation based on those elevations. And that will basically inundate the entire property. The other option for the resident is to do the analysis, do the study to determine what the actual calculated base flood elevation is using hydraulic modeling and so on. And by setting that elevation, they can then determine how high they need to build their homes. So they have to be at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation to be within compliance for FEMA, or in other words, to not have to pay flood insurance. If they were to build in the floodplain, they can do that, but they have to show that they can offset the floodplain storage with the amount of fill that they put on the property. What that basically grants them is a letter of map amendment. What we're talking about here globally, or looking at the city of Arlington as a whole, would be a full letter of map revision. So the amendment doesn't change the map in Arlington. It only allows them to construct on their property. The revision would replace the current map with the higher resolution map and give the city of Arlington floodplain elevation throughout the entire creek corridor. So any additional development in areas of town that happen to be developed, anybody that's currently mapped that maybe shouldn't be, or again vice versa, ones that aren't mapped now that should be mapped, all of that would be known citywide versus at the single property. Yes, and really, when all is said and done, for them to construct their home on their property, it really is the residents' responsibility to determine what those elevations are. That isn't necessarily the city of Arlington's responsibility. As administrator of the floodplain, the city does have some responsibility in making sure that the residents understand risk, and really in enforcing the floodplain ordinance and so on. That is the city's responsibility as a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program.
So looking at the map that we have now in front of us, what would be the city of Arlington's responsibility with this certain property?
To enforce the ordinance.
Which is to say that they have to build at a certain elevation?
Correct.
And that's only can be determined by the work that you do on their property?
That is correct, because there currently is not a mapped base flood elevation at their property.
Okay.
Yep, it's just a boundary. They could build outside of that boundary, but there's a little sliver of property and it's at a much higher elevation. So, according from what I understand of the process at the site right now, it would be very difficult for them to build the house outside of the currently mapped floodplain. So by establishing that elevation, they can pick a better line on their property where that elevation ties in, and then determine their home footprint and how high they need to build their foundation and so on from there.
Thanks, that was very helpful.
You're very welcome.
And last time you were here, you kind of estimated, just guessing, that you thought maybe the same amount would go in as would come out, roughly. I mean, just by looking at,
What do you mean?
well,
Number of properties, you
number of
mean?
properties,
Number of properties.
you kind of thought that it'd be, there might be some people that go in, but there'd be some that will go out, and you thought it'd probably even out.
It tends to be that way. It tends to be that way. The parcels that are directly adjacent to the creek tend to be in the floodplain. FEMA's insurance requirement is based on the structure, not the parcel. So the situations that we see quite often are lending agencies or insurance companies saying, no, if you're going to refinance or you're going to purchase this home, you need to have flood insurance, and they look at only the intersection of the parcel line with the floodplain boundary and not where the structure lies on the property. So that usually initiates, again, a letter of map amendment that rides with the property itself, but doesn't revise the floodplain for the entire corridor. So we've done this process in a few other communities of similar size, and we've offered our assistance with the residents. I've received phone calls directly from residents asking how to do the letter of map amendment process and how to go through that, and it's pretty painless for the residents when all is said and done, especially when there's a high resolution or a more accurate floodplain boundary. We have a lot more flexibility in how we can apply for a letter of map amendment with a higher resolution data. So that part of it ends up being, less burdensome for the residents in the end.
What would you estimate that the effect on the property value would be if some houses did go into the flood?
That's a kind of a difficult question to answer, because I don't really know. I mean, it kind of depends on the level of risk. You know, if the home itself, the structure itself is in the floodplain, that's a significant issue, just in terms of risk. We can look at, you know, the risk of flooding over the course of a 30-year mortgage. FEMA does have a product that will help determine that. Homes that have a letter of map amendment that ride with the property that show that they're out, they don't lose value at all. There may be a piece of the property that's inundated, you know, once every 10 years, once every 50 years. But it's really the structures that are directly impacted by flooding that tend to see the lowest value, or highest impact to those rates. So it's kind of the price you pay for living next to the beautiful creek. You know, everybody wants to be close to the water, and we certainly love that in Minnesota. But there's some risk that's associated with that, and it's important that residents understand that.
Do we know, has there ever been any flood damage to any homes in Arlington in the
There
past?
what?
Has there ever been any flood damage to property owners' homes in the last 50 years?
Well, there's been basement flood damage, but are you talking about properties adjacent
To the
to the creek?
To the creek
Okay.
that got flooded out because of a flood?
I don't know.
I've never heard of one, but just because I didn't hear of it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
I can't think of any.
No. Me neither.
Yeah, there are a lot of communities in Minnesota that have a ton of policies, but have never had a claim. You know, when we talk about flooding, it's really more a matter of when, not if. And that's just, you know, understanding risk again.
I'm just trying to
Going
figure
back
out
to that.
the percentages of it.
Yeah.
If it hasn't happened in 50 or 80 years, what's the likelihood it's even going to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's
And
a really great
we
question.
can do this, and I can see the positives to doing this, and I can see the negatives
Yep.
to doing it.
Yep.
And I'm trying to figure out, what's the likelihood this will ever even happen?
Yeah.
I mean, we can buy hurricane insurance here too, but the likelihood of us getting hit isn't too darn likely.
Yeah. That's,
Remnants.
you know, the 100-year flood event is what we're looking at
Yep.
here. That's what's mapped by FEMA. And you know, it's not necessarily saying that we'll only get one in 100 years. It just means that we have a 1% chance every year of potentially seeing that flood. 1% is pretty low. We could go 600 years without seeing it, and then have 6 in a row. You know, so it's a probability game when we talk about hydrology and hydraulics. So, yeah. Well, that's a really great and really valid point.
Okay, any other questions, concerns?
What was the total cost on the project?
15,000.
$770.
Yeah, that includes survey, hydraulic modeling, and all the paperwork required for FEMA.
How much was it?
15,770.
And that letter of map and amendment in there and everything like that as well,
Correct.
with that amount?
Yep.
I know there's the number floating around of what it would cost that particular property owner if they were to do it on their own, and I've heard around 10. I'm wondering whether some negotiations might be in order between the city and that property owner to lower their cost and pick up some on a city basis then.
Well, I feel like I'm on the opposite side of that.
Okay?
I don't feel like the residents of the community should have to pay the majority or pay for a letter of a map of an amendment for one property owner in town.
The revision itself is only one step. There will likely be letters of map amendment required by residents after this is done as well. You know, so it's kind of a twofold scenario. So it's something to consider as well.
Okay, any further questions? All right, thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah, thank
Appreciate
you very
it.
much.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on the agenda to city administrator recruitment. Mr. Gary Wires from David Brown Associates. Good evening, Gary.
Good evening. Great to be back here with you this evening. So tonight, tonight's important task regarding this item anyway is to select people to come in for the final interview before the city council. Couple of things to point out. This will be what I would say a quirky discussion in that candidates at this point are non-public information. Therefore, you have knowledge of who these folks are, and I have knowledge of who these folks are, but no one else does. And we have to have tonight's discussion using numbers and no identifiers. So not only can we not talk about people's names, but if you said candidate number 1 is a employee in city X, well, we've just identified who that person is. So that's not acceptable either. So we need to stick to the numbers. That's why, I mean, again, it's quirky, I get it, but unfortunately none of us make the law on how this goes. Just as an example, tomorrow night I'm going to Amory, Wisconsin for the exact same discussion. They can do this process in closed session there and therefore have a more open discussion, but it's in closed session. So different states have different laws regarding that. So I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that kind of the ground rules before we get started. Other items to talk about once you have selected finalists are to talk about what do you want to do for interviews? Do you want to do those over 1 day or 2? I know one of you has some concern about doing it over 2 days and would prefer to do it over 1. We can talk all of those options through based on what sort of components you want to include in the interview process. There's no right or wrong way to do an interview process. It really is up to you what you feel is the right fit for you, and we'll talk about those options as well. So with that said, the most fruitful way that I have found to have this dialogue about candidates is simply to have each council member go around and provide their top 3 candidates. That way, a lot of times it kind of lines up.
Right.
And there's some convergence on certain candidates, and there are some candidates who aren't mentioned at all by any council members, and then there's some kind of in the middle. Well, it's the ones in the middle that warrant discussion. If all of you agree that candidate number 18 should be included, well, what's the point in talking about that candidate? They're in. If they're not mentioned at all, candidate number 25 is not mentioned at all, no point in having much discussion there either. So what I would suggest that we do for this part is simply go around. Laura and I both have a little a score sheet, if you will, to kind of keep track of what each person has said, and then we can feed back to you what those rankings look like after you've done that. So that's my suggestion for moving forward.
Do you want these 3 listed as one's first choice, second choice, and third choice?
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, again, usually there's just a natural convergence that occurs, but certainly if you have ordered them in such a way, yes, provide them that way. Yes.
Anyone
All right.
start?
Tom, you want to go ahead and we'll just move around the table?
12, 9, 10.
Okay.
4, 9, 12.
Which ones?
4 to the
4, 9, 12.
2. Yes, sir.
725.
7, 5, 8.
Wrong person.
Oh, I guess,
It'll be you.
Not me.
my top 3 choices are number 9.
Your top 3 choices are number 9.
Well, I didn't
And
pick-
maybe the other
what
one
else?
would be 8.
7, 8, 1.
All right. So Laura and I will just take a minute, kind of tally this up, and then feed that back to you.
You don't have another one?
9, I'll add another 9. I just gotta say this because it's been burning on me for 2 days. I was so disappointed in the choices that we have. Looking at some of the resumes and so forth, it looked like some of the people could walk on water, and I just Googled their name. It just
So-
scared the hell out of me.
Yeah, so be careful. Google is not a reliable source to make decisions on. I understand people, the value of that, but be careful.
And I know that, but when there's newspaper articles and other documents that aren't just somebody running off at the mouth on a wild tangent, I was really disappointed. You know, if the other 28 candidates were less than this, they must have just graduated from high school.
Okay,
Those are my feelings.
all right, clearly.
So if you want me to, I'll tell you how I
so-
really clearly.
All right.
Oh my God.
So let's, let me report back on, so candidates number 7, 8, and 9 were each mentioned 3 times. So those 3, candidate number 7 actually was mentioned, the first listed, all 3 of those times. Candidate number 8 and 9 were more varied where they appeared, but 7, 8, and 9. And then candidate number 5, I had listed twice. Is that what you had too, Laura?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And then there were, after that, there were candidate number 1, 2, 4, 10, and 12, each mentioned once. So you have like 7, 8, 9 that were your 3 most commonly mentioned people. And then candidate number 5 was also mentioned by 2 of you. as
12
that-
was mentioned twice,
12
Yeah.
was twice.
only because I know that I mentioned.
Oh, you're
it
right,
sort-
I just
sort of
missed
bit.
that, you're right. All right, thank you.
Not that that makes a difference, but.
No, it does,
It
it
could
does
at the
make,
end.
it does make a difference,
5
so
was
thank you
mentioned
for that.
twice.
And I had it down twice, I only recorded it once, so you're
Sorry for
absolutely right.
interrupting you.
No, I'm glad you did. So, yeah, so you have 3 candidates mentioned 3 times, 2 candidates mentioned twice. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 candidates mentioned once, and the rest not at all. So this is kind of generally, like I said earlier, there tends to be kind of a little bit of a convergence there in the process. So I encourage you to not dip below 3 candidates for who you want to bring in for interviews. There is always a chance, and it happens regularly, there's always a chance that one or more of these people is looking elsewhere. And they could be interviewing today, we don't know it, and they accept a job and they're out. So I would never encourage you to go below 3 candidates, because chances are that somebody between now and interview time, or even as soon as I call them, now I did touch base with people today and said, if your status has changed, let me know. No one did, but that could change every day. So, so I don't encourage you to go below 3. If you want to go as high as 5, that's to me is a great number. If one drops off or something, you just go with the remaining 4 then, if you were to go that route. I'm not trying to tell you who you should bring in, just giving you kind of some idea about what normally shapes up.
I think we should shoot for all 5.
I do too.
The 5 that were,
The
yeah,
5
okay.
well, the ones that were mentioned, numbers 7, 8, 9, 12, and 5. The ones that were mentioned 3 times or 2 times.
Yep.
Because there could be one there that maybe we only gave 2 and they could come in and,
Wawas.
Exactly right, and
Yeah.
we have time to do one more.
Exactly,
Or
and,
two.
and generally, yeah, right, there isn't
I'd
really
rather
a
do an
harm
extra
in,
than not,
right,
and lose something.
yeah, yeah. So if you wanted to do that, again, it would make the conversation simple, you wouldn't even have to talk about the others that all had number, that came up one time, you know. So I mean, I'm completely comfortable with that, but it's your call to make.
So we're thinking 5, 7, 8, and 9, is that what I'm hearing?
5, 7, 8, 9, 12.
12.
And 12.
5, 7, 8, 9.
And if one of those are gone, we're down to 4.
Right.
Did I hear you correctly, that once, if we agree as a group on the 5 or on the 3, those names then become public?
That is
All right,
correct.
okay.
Once the law says in Minnesota, once the candidates for these positions are selected for interview by the appointing authority, you, the city council is the appointing authority in this case, those names become public at that time.
Okay.
And candidates are all advised of that in advance as well, so.
Okay, group, how do you feel about the 5?
I'm all for it.
I'd like to see 5 moving
Yeah.
forward.
The one thing that concerns me, I guess, we haven't really gotten to it, but are we gonna reimburse people to come here? Okay,
I wouldn't reimburse them.
that's fine,
They're the
because
ones
that's,
looking for the
well,
job.
no, right, that's because there's one of them is not close,
Is that the one we can't say?
right,
Right.
so that's,
But that would be his choice.
yeah, exactly.
So
There,
for all
yeah.
we know, he could be on vacation and be in Minnesota at this
Then
time.
I'm okay with the 5.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
looks
good.
like we have a consensus.
All right.
He has
I-
that choice whether he wants
well,
to come here or not.
I think if they're in the running for it, they're gonna do what, if they really want it and really wanna be there, they're gonna do what it takes.
Right.
And I think the compensation that we're going to be paying them in the position anyhow is probably fine.
Okay, all right.
So comfortable with
We
those,
do have a
with those
consensus,
5? All
yes.
right, so it's candidate number 5, 7, 8, 9, 12.
Correct.
All right. I will be reaching out to these folks right away, all 12. I always call, let people know where they're at with the process, so. And then all the background work will start immediately on these folks as well. So, so with that then, let's talk about the interview process. You've already addressed, or at least sounds like you've addressed the reimbursement question is no reimbursement. That's fine with me. I always bring it up just as a point of discussion. Probably about half or somewhere in that neighborhood do some sort of reimbursement, others don't. Makes no difference to me. So, should we talk then about interview components? Whether you want to do interviews over 1 day, 2 days, somewhat that the number of things you want to do as part of the interview process will somewhat drive that. But a lot of times, I can work with that. If there are strong feelings that you want to do it in 1 day, then we'll do it in 1 day. So.
Is packing it, doing a thorough job, asking all the right questions. What kind of a day is 1 day?
So a typical 1 day interview process for this type of position would go something like this. In the morning would be what I would term as committee interviews. That might be, you might want to have a community panel do an interview. You might want to have your department heads, your staff do an interview of the candidates. Sometimes city councils want to do individual interviews, one-on-one interviews, each of you with each of the candidates. So that would be typically the morning, again, depending on the components. And then the afternoon into the evening would be the final interview of this body collectively with each of the candidates. And that's up to about an hour, I'd say 45-minute interview each. So it really, your time commitment, depending on how we structure it, would probably start late morning. unless you want to do individual interviews, and then you just pretty much the whole day. So if you wanted to do, for example though, if you wanted to do like a community event, a meet and greet type event, well, doing interviews in one day makes that a little bit difficult, because that type of event takes time and you don't have as much time available to do that. But we could do it. I mean, what I would do then is probably we'd try to do it over lunch or something. Have, you know, a community, like an open house, where community members can just come in and meet the candidates between, you know, 11:30 and 12:30 or something. So we could do that as well. Compresses things a little bit, but very doable.
What's the advantage of the community? I mean, do we get feedback from the community, or is it just so they can meet?
You can see how they interact maybe with the community.
Yeah, that's a great question, you know, and my answer is always, and I'm not, you know, trying to not answer the question, but my answer is always, well, the meaning is up to you,
Right.
whether that adds value to the process or not. Some communities say, absolutely, we must do this. Others say, there's really no point in doing that, because the people here are elected to make this decision, and they will. So I don't know that it adds value or not from my perspective. That's your call.
To me, maybe it would add value if you had an opportunity to get feedback from the people afterwards.
Which is very difficult to do in a
Not a one-day deal,
unstructured
not
setting.
gonna happen.
Right.
So now they get to meet them and talk with them, and we have no idea.
You could
Other
do
than-
though, I mean, I have at times, if you wanted some community involvement, there are other ways to do that. For example, you could have a community panel do an actual interview, and they would fill out a rating form based on the interview. That was one of those panel interviews that I mentioned that could be taking place in the morning. Short interviews, 20 to 30 minutes. We're rotating candidates around, so, you know, and with a panel like that, a lot of times what I say is just each of you pick one person. You just pick whoever you want to be on that panel. Or the other way to do it is to try and figure out, well, who should we invite? And then the list gets like long and difficult, and you'd start debating, well, should that person or shouldn't it? But that, I mean, that's another way to get community input if you wanted to have an actual community panel participate, or even two panels participate in the interview that way. But then you're selecting people. That's not open to the public
Yep.
to come in
We
and
would
just
each
fire
select
questions.
or however.
That's one way to do it, right? Right.
Would you include like some type of tour, or would that be?
That would be another thing we could do, and we could have that even like first thing in the morning when candidates arrive, load them up in a van, drive them around town for 30 minutes. Usually, you know, somebody that on staff, or, you know, somebody that knows the town really well, or the mayor, or, you know, whoever would do that. Absolutely, we could do that as well, yep. A lot of times people are coming in, you know, a lot of these people, particularly if we start early, they're gonna be coming in and, you know, kind of doing their own research too, but if you wanted to do a tour, absolutely we can. Glad you mentioned that. I left that out when I was making comments, so.
I like the idea of giving them a tour.
I like that for sure.
I do, and, you know, with having 5 candidates though, I mean, right off the bat, we're talking, you know, a solid 5 hours. I mean, it's gonna be a full day regardless, and it could probably stream out a couple of days, honestly, to be fair and to give them, and
The last administrator we hired, we did 5 in one day. And we had a social gathering in the evening or late afternoon.
And who was involved in that social gathering? Do you recall?
Spouses on
Okay,
all sides.
okay.
And I don't remember if there were
of the candidates,
the candidate, their
Spouse.
spouse,
okay.
And then was it the council then, or
the
was?
council spouses.
Council spouses?
Yep.
Okay.
I don't know if there were businessmen in town or not. I'd have to check maybe with Jim Kraft. He did the tour.
Okay.
Brooklyn drove the bus.
Well, I do like the final interview with the full council.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
I'm
And
not
that
sure
should
we
be
need,
after the, at the end of the day.
right, I'm
I
not sure we
feel.
need one-on-one interviews. I
No.
don't know if that really adds.
No, I think
don't
if
think
we
so.
sat here with each individual candidate, we could probably come to a decision, I think. Last two could be tough, but
Yeah.
And I think if we had some kind of social gathering maybe before the final interview, is that typically when that would happen, maybe?
Like at noon, late
Yeah.
morning.
That would help as well. I mean, because each of us could have that little, personal connection or that moment that we could take and rotate amongst them to really
even if you
have that personal.
2-3 minutes with
Yeah.
each person.
Right,
talking,
it doesn't have to be a
Could
lot.
be a huge 2-3 minutes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Usually what I do with that, if you do something like that and you've got a nice room right over here, is like put people at stations. So the
Right.
candidates are at, in 5 different locations
Yep.
in here. And, then the visitors, you included, just wander from
that.
spot to spot. And, and so it's a little bit structured, but it still gives everyone the opportunity to make the rounds.
Right.
And so typically though, if something like that, if you're gonna attend, then we'd post it as a public meeting, then I'd say just open it up to the public. Anybody who wants to come can come. So, it's,
I kind of like the idea of the public, even if they have nothing to say. I kind of like it. It's like we're involving them.
Yeah, you get a certain amount of buy-in
And we
to the
know
process.
how well
Some
the,
of them will talk to some of us.
yeah,
Well, we would hope they do, will give us their impression.
we know how well the police deal went over. Went with the citizens, it went over very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we had a very good showing, so we know there was interest. And I think we would still get some interest. I mean, some can't come because of work, but
Right.
the ones that want to attend are going to make it pop. I mean, they're gonna be here.
Well, I find it difficult during the day. I mean, honestly, if I wasn't on the council, I don't think I'd take off work.
So I say that,
But I mean, and not that it's not an important thing, I'm just saying that it's difficult for most people are out of town during the day and they're not gonna drive back to do it, so.
but I don't know how we could possibly do, I mean, if we did it an evening deal with the candidates and us and the community, then we'd have to be an evening. Now we're gonna have to turn it into a 2-day deal, we're gonna have to
Right.
have these candidates stay overnight here.
right.
I'm not sure we wanna do that.
Well, unless you did like a 2-day starting at a meet the candidates thing the night before and then the interview the next day. Then at
That's
least,
what I'm talking
Still
then at
stay
least you
on,
wouldn't be, you could still get that input from the citizen. But, right, but it wouldn't be like in between when they met them and before we had interviews.
But we're
So
gonna
by the-
require them to stay overnight then.
That's true.
That's the only part I don't like about that.
Mhm.
I don't really wanna make them spend any more money than they have to.
Especially when we don't have our motel.
Our new motel up yet?
Yeah.
I thought you were on that years ago, man.
It's right next to the water park.
I know Ross said he wanted to invest, and
Yeah.
he knew where there were other investors, so.
What about possibly doing like the full day thing and then coming back the next evening and making a decision? Or would we wanna make the decision right away? I mean, the people wouldn't have to be here for that,
I think when it's fresh.
then it's better.
But you don't have to make a decision. So, if at the end of the process, you're deliberating and you're on the fence, well, then it's like regroup, come
Yeah.
back, even wait till your next council meeting or schedule a special or something like that. I mean, the last thing you wanna do is make too quick of a decision, so you can always just, deal with that scenario if it presents. Cause I've seen it happen. Usually it doesn't. Usually people are kind of locked in, but if not, just take a step back.
So we aren't gonna put them all on a stage in a row and then put a crown on one.
Well, that would be,
Only if you want
That'd be
to.
awesome.
that would be an option.
She's
Um,
proud.
So if you're looking at one day, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, in the morning, if you wanted to have your department heads do something, we could do that easily. Real short interview with department heads, get some feedback from them, I'd put that together for you. We could take care of the tour. Maybe if you're not having any other panels, you could even do one of the final interviews if you wanted, say at like 11 or something, and then have that social event from 12 to 1, and then pick up the interviews again after that time. I mean, it can go either way, or if your preference would be start interviews after that social event, well, then we just stretch them into the evening a little bit. It doesn't make any difference.
I think that'd be the fairest to everybody.
I agree with you.
I mean,
Start after
yeah,
lunch, if you
right,
will.
because the one person
Okay.
who goes before would be,
Yeah, we don't, yeah, that's not fair to that one person.
no.
Okay,
But I like
it's no
your,
problem.
But
I like
I'm-
your program, though.
Yeah.
Okay,
I know it's gonna be a longer day,
Yes.
but we
I
can
mean-
accomplish a lot in that day.
yeah, yeah.
The one thing I would
What-
suggest is, I would not wanna have the social as an actual meal. It gets very difficult for
No.
people, if that's gonna be their lunch break.
It's a good point.
It gets very difficult for the interviewees to have a break. So what ends up happening is there's a lot of food that gets ordered and none of it gets eaten. Because who wants to be interviewing with spinach in their teeth?
Yeah.
Or try and grab a bite while
Yeah,
You
the
talk
person's
to
walking
a
by.
little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm,
So maybe what we should do for the candidates' benefit,
give them,
build a lunch break in
Correct.
before this social event,
yes,
and then it's just like water and cookies or
Exactly.
something.
Mhm.
Okay,
yep,
that would work. I don't see anything
Yep.
stopping that either, so.
Yep.
That way they have a chance to, if they've brought a lunch, or they can go out, just take care of that first, so.
Well, I think it would
That's
be
a great-
difficult to
Notify
have
them and
lunch
let
with
them
all
know.
Oh,
of
yeah,
them
oh,
and
yeah.
trying to have that cross
So they're
conversation.
prepared for that.
Just,
If people are allowed or able to come, you don't wanna everybody be eating and people come in and not being able to eat, so you don't know who to
Yeah.
plan for or how many people are coming.
Mm-hmm.
so do you think like during that point or whatever too, the council goes off, everybody just has a lunch break at one certain
Yeah,
time?
I think so.
Everybody kinda does their own thing?
I think you're gonna wanna
Yeah.
recharge moment.
Your-
They're gonna wanna
Nothing else to
recharge.
get away
moment.
from it for a while.
And your first activity of the day
Yeah.
is probably gonna be the social.
That's
Right.
true. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, unless you come up with something else that you personally wanna participate in the morning, I would say you're starting at noon, for example,
Mhm.
as a council, so you just eat before you come,
And
and
we're not needed before that.
probably not,
Mhm.
right? Maybe the mayor, if we do the tour,
Do
or
the
somebody's
tour.
gonna do the
Yeah.
tour,
Yeah.
but we'll work that out.
Yep.
So, are you comfortable with your staff and/or department heads? I mean, you have a small enough staff, we could almost include everybody
Sure.
on a panel if you wanted. And I always tell groups like this, you're not picking your boss here. You're simply gonna give input. I take the input down, write it up, hand it to you. So you have their input, but it's not like they're voting or anything on candidates. It's more,
I like that idea.
so, okay.
Yeah, I think we
Really
should.
like it.
So I'll figure that part out more, and I can actually work on some of
Yep.
those details, getting that stuff worked out, but, okay. All right, I think we're,
That's good.
any other questions?
Would the council want one individual as a specified spokesperson to, for example, releasing the names, conversing with the media, that type of stuff?
As far as,
In the event, like, the public would come up to you and say, well, who'd you guys end up picking, that type of stuff. Sometimes what I've seen is folks have said, we want all media requests, all public contact come to either Gary, myself, because especially when you start dealing with the candidates now, we're gonna have public and private information.
Right.
And so you're gonna want somebody who's responding, who is able to sort through,
Right.
and I think it's helpful to have that person identified, so that the media knows who to go to get their
And,
info.
and just so you know, my preference is that be a city official, not me, because I don't represent your interests. Now, we can do, like, redact the resumes, and, I mean, because almost a lot of information in a resume is actually public
Yes.
information, but we
Yep.
could redact those, send them to Laura, if you wanted her to be the point person for releasing that. I mean, we can do that really quickly.
And it'll work with your
That would work,
schedule,
yeah.
with your, because you can always be reached on the phone, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Great.
sounds good.
Okay,
Okay,
great. Well, I will, soon as I'll start working on a schedule right away, probably Thursday of this week, get that kind of figured out. But I would say again, for you all, based on what I've heard tonight, I would anticipate noonish start for your activities, but then plan into the evening because, with 5 interviews,
Right.
that social thing, so plan a little bit later.
Do we have the date
That's
fixed?
what I was gonna
Oh,
ask. I was gonna
sorry.
ask the same question.
Yeah, that's where I was going
Yeah,
to.
so there were two dates originally that we targeted, September 25 and 26. Wouldn't that have been something if I'd have left here without talking about the
Oh,
actual?
boy.
We'd have got a hold of you.
Yeah, I know, sorry about that. So September 25 and 26 were the dates, and I don't have my calendar. Monday, Tuesday,
Tuesday, yeah.
so up to you if you,
Doesn't Mondays work better for you? as
Either one is
on-
fine. Monday or Tuesday work fine for me, just
Oh,
not
okay.
both.
either or.
Squeeze it into either?
Well, I'll just not cut grass.
Do you have a meeting
You can
that
cut
week?
grass in the morning.
No,
when
we
you
do
don't
not.
All
have
right,
any.
so you wouldn't have that
In one.
issue.
Right,
there are a couple meetings, committee meetings that evening of the 25th, but they could be rescheduled, but they are scheduled right now. Cemetery
For
Committee and the Parks
Parks.
Committee. So if we'd want to just avoid that conflict,
Well, I think the
Entirely.
Cemetery got moved.
cemetery got moved to 11th.
Yeah,
cemetery is moved to 11th?
Yes,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Okay.
but
park.
Parks is still
Parks
on.
would still be on.
But that could be moved too if it works better for you, for your
Yeah,
work schedule.
whatever.
I mean, if
26.
it works
You
for
know
Adam,
what,
we
I
can move
almost
on.
like doing it
All right.
Monday better because they would have Sunday as a travel day
Right.
and then get here on Monday instead of having Monday as that travel day.
Take one
2
day
days,
off of work.
right.
Right,
You only have to take one day off of work. We
Yep.
do Tuesday,
Yeah,
we travel
that's a
Monday,
good
Tuesday.
point.
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
I like that for the candidates, it would
Yeah.
work much better,
Makes
it would work
sense.
better for Adam. Well, if it helps you, why not?
Right in the-
Either day
yeah,
is
why
fine.
not?
You wanna do the 25th?
Let's do the
Yeah.
25th.
25th?
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, it's a great point about travel too, because they can do it, and then they wouldn't have to, if they're traveling a distance, they wouldn't have to take 2 days off, so.
Or more, potentially, yeah.
Okay. All right, anything else? Any other questions? All right, so I'll work with Laura on, some of the details and we'll get you a schedule.
Well, I was gonna ask a
Relative,
question,
so-
Gary. Are you gonna check with the candidates that we selected before their names go public, or are their names could be public now officially?
So the law doesn't make any provision for checking first.
It
So
did not?
It does not.
But you said you did have contact recently, like
They all-
today?
They all know that upon being named a finalist, that their name becomes public. So I have advised each of these 12 of that possibility, so they know that, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very, very
Appreciate it.
much.
Very good.
Thank you. Just one point, I have to apologize for maybe moving on too fast as regard to the Highland Creek floodplain mapping. Did you folks want to make a decision on that tonight, or do you need time to think about that? We certainly can make a decision on it if you're ready. Otherwise, it'll be on the next agenda.
I feel like
Next
I'm ready
month.
to make a decision on it.
Do we, I guess one of the things I don't know is how many houses are designated as in the floodplain? Do we?
Well, there's
now.
51 to 52 houses
I think it was
along the creek.
Right.
Now, how many of them 51 are in the floodplain? I don't think we know that number.
We don't know that.
So we don't know if we're affecting 10, 12, 30, 40, or what. I think it was 51 was the
Right,
number
I saw
along the
that
creek.
Yep.
in the map. Could we send a letter with a questionnaire, or are we opening up a can of worms? Or?
I kind of thought about that or whatever too, Jim, thinking that, at least the 50 residents that would potentially be affected or not. But honestly, if we decide to go ahead and spend, $10,000 or whatever we're deciding to spend, that's actually coming out of everybody's pockets, not just those 51
Right,
residents. So I guess that's how I'm looking at
Yeah, I'm
at
not
that.
concerned Well, I am concerned about spending the money, but, in talking with Mark, Lindstrom, you know, if a person is not in a their house is not designated as being in a floodplain, and they get flooded, they don't have any insurance. The insurance will not
They think they
cover.
have, but they don't.
Pardon?
Okay, but I think we need to get this point, and I don't know the answer to this. Let's say, the way it's set up now, is there anything designated so that we would run into that problem?
You're asking of those 51 houses,
Yes.
are any of them actually in the plain?
Yes,
I'm
are there,
sure there
we have people in the floodplain? With the way it's mapped now, is there such a thing as people are in the floodplain? Or is that something we're going to create by doing this?
Right
I talked to 2 different residents that have property very low and more than likely will end up in the floodplain. And they are adamantly against us doing this.
Have their houses been
That's-
flooded in the past?
No. And one of them's about as low as it can get. I'm not gonna use a name,
Right.
but his property is about as low as anywhere along that creek. He has not been flooded, or they have not, whatever.
And Michelle brought this up last time, they could buy insurance if they want, and Jim brought it up tonight.
But they can go buy flood
Yeah, exactly,
insurance
and it's-
even
and
if we
it's,
don't do this.
It's a quarter of the cost.
At
Right.
way less cost.
Especially if they're not mandated.
And I was at a loss of what I wanted to do, so that, well, I'm gonna go talk to some people. And the answer I got was, even, albeit 2 people, no. That's why I'm hanging on the edge right now.
Well, you know, I'm the same way, you know,
Yeah,
do we do the survey and maybe we get some people out of the floodplain, or do we do the survey and all of a sudden now people are in the floodplain and have to buy the
Now, once
insurance?
they're in, you're correct, they're gonna have to buy it.
Or do you wait for the flood and have them flood out and say, nobody told me?
Well, you know, what I have to say to that is common sense tells you that in the rains that we've had in the last 3-4 years, and the way that the water comes up, there was quite a few homes that we sandbagged. And I helped on that, the city helped on that, properties as well. No, they know, and common sense tells you that if the water's coming up like this, gosh, maybe I should get myself some flood insurance. I mean, and without mandating them to pay what FEMA wants them to pay if they are in that floodplain. So I guess my feeling is that I don't wanna do it.
And then one other thing, the people that currently are in the floodplain, if they so choose, could get them mapped on themselves and get out if they think that they are not in there.
That's what he said, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, if the people want to get out, there's an option to do it.
Potentially.
Potentially,
They have to,
yes.
you know, it's just like anything else, you know, you take the risk yourself on and say, okay, gosh, I'm gonna spend the $5,000 because you know what, it's gonna save me
Right.
for a year, I'll save 5,000 if I spend the 5,000, maybe, or maybe it won't.
Well,
But
the other-
that's their gamble, I don't think it's all the citizens in the community's gamble to take, so.
If they've refinanced or financed a house in the last 10 years, I would be pretty certain that the finance company would know if their property is in the floodplain or not.
I would think
If they,
so.
if they're close, they're gonna require them to carry flood insurance.
And they'll
And
have to buy it.
if they're close, but not close enough where they could get flooded, you know, to spend the $400 or $500 a year to be covered is
Just
pretty
in
cheap,
case.
cheaper than 2,000. I'm not good at math, but
Oh, your numbers are right, so, you're right, Joe.
And one other thing we could do instead of spending the money is maybe educate some of the people along that line with that there is a potential that you could be flooded and you may want to look into flood insurance, you know.
Could the
Something.
city draft up some type of letter, I mean, are we putting the city's neck in the noose by maybe drawing up
maybe,
a
yeah.
letter and explaining to the residents along the creek the flood deal? Or don't we even wanna go there?
Well, what about even a blurb in the newsletter or something?
Well, something like that, yeah.
I
Right.
mean, just saying,
Yeah.
hey, you know, we just gained this knowledge, we wanted to share it with everybody.
For someone that hasn't thought about it and could go out for $400 a year and make sure they're okay, I'd like to know that information, because I'm sure I would spend the $400.
And how many people know that it's law for them to have flood insurance if they're in a floodplain?
Well, their mortgage
If they
company.
Their mortgage companies would force them.
Yeah.
But right now, it's not, it may not be in the floodplain with the way it's drawn right now.
Correct.
And then after the flood happens, it's too late. And so this way, these people can know that they have the potential of being in the floodplain, and if they wanna take their chances, they won't get any, but at least they know that they run the risk.
I think at a minimum, we have to do that in a newsletter, at least make them aware.
Could put a paragraph or two in the city newsletter, just,
Well, September is National Preparedness Month,
there we go.
so we could do some type of just general, I mean, it'd be very easy to make flooding an
Well,
option,
it's
a
in the
discussion.
news.
Yeah, yeah, it's in the
Already.
news, yeah, they've
Yeah.
been talking about it, but I mean, it, you know, to take it from a, are you prepared standpoint versus getting into the nitty gritty of
Right.
all of this,
Yeah.
because, you know, yeah, there's the 100-year flood, but then there's also the 500-year flood, and if that happens while we're all living in our house, it might have each of us differently, so, I mean, we could easily do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I take it,
So I'll make a motion to decline, spending the money on, the, what was it, the, High Island Creek floodplain mapping.
I'll second.
okay, motion by Councilmember Batchor, second by Councilmember Cowell to not proceed with the floodplain mapping. Is there,
Yeah,
is there further discussion?
right, do we want to include the bit in the paper or the newsletter in the motion, or should that be?
I think that's just a separate
I think that
directive.
can just be a direction. to
Sure.
staff.
Okay.
No, here again, I'm on the fence. I think that we almost owe it to the citizens so they know if they're in danger or not. You know, so I guess I'm on the other side of the fence. I think we should do it, do the survey.
He did mention, and it was brought up briefly, about a flood ordinance. Are we violating the ordinance by not doing it? That's, I'm wondering what the city, what responsibility we have to adhere to that ordinance.
I personally don't think so, because we have a map. You know,
Okay.
it doesn't say what type of map we have, and I think you just mentioned that last meeting.
Okay,
FEMA map.
Yeah.
okay.
And if if FEMA feels that it needs to be updated, they're gonna update it, and they're gonna do it for free, without us spending the money. So if they felt the need that it was totally whacked and totally way off, they would've came back probably, I'd imagine, and say, hey, this ain't right.
One
Let's
would
redo
think.
it. Let's rethink this, or let's remap this.
Okay, we do have a motion by Councilmember Batchor, second by Councilmember Hattlestead to not proceed with the mapping proposed by Bolton and Mank.
That was seconded by Adam.
Oh, I'm sorry, second by Cowell. I'm sorry, Adam.
It's your fault.
All right, further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No,
Was that a no also?
Yes.
Okay. Motion passes 3 votes to 2. So that item is taken care of. Yes,
I guess I have 2 questions. Could we step back one more agenda item? Do you have to vote and approve the selections? And then my other question is, we go to press tomorrow, so I'd really like to get that in the paper. That's why, Labor Day holiday, if it would have been on our meeting last night, wouldn't have been such a rush, but, so I just wanna know how that's gonna
Well, this is a public meeting and we've narrowed it down to 5, so I mean, if somebody is asking what the names of those 5 are, I feel we have an obligation to divulge that at this time. But, but do you just want the names or do you want a bio on each one of them? That I can't give you.
I would want is a name of the town, or maybe a name and what their current position is. So I'm not asking for,
Maybe a
I
name
can,
and a
I
town.
can get you, I'll email you the names and I'll see if I can get the current positions soon. I think I've got access to all that, so, but it.
Or at least where they're
Or
from.
town.
Town.
Yeah.
Well, that's not public information.
Oh, that isn't?
Mm-mm.
Oh,
Hmm.
No,
Well, even
but their current job is, so. we
even
can-
the names would be nice.
Yep.
If I say,
Yes, I can
you have selected 5, everybody I guess.
say who.
papers
Yeah,
will
yeah.
Yeah, I'll
know
email that
5.
to you.
Is that something like?
Yes, I can do it like tonight or first thing in the morning. Mm-hmm.
Like a little early tomorrow to finish.
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do we need to make a motion for those 5? If so, I will.
You wouldn't necessarily, but if you'd like, we certainly could.
I'll make a motion that we interview candidates 5, 7, 8, 9, and 12.
Second.
okay, motion by Councilmember Hattlestead, second by Councilmember Batchor to interview candidates 5, what's it, 5?
5,
7, 8,
5,
9,
7,
12.
8, 9, 12. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried.
Can you believe it, I paid
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, by the way, let the minutes read that interim police chief Nienaber is present at the meeting. He walked in a little bit after the meeting started, and I forgot to mention that. We'll move on to item 10, recruitment requests.
All right, well, yes, as we noted in the, as part of the consent agenda, we have had a resignation in the police department, and so, this came late last week, and so it was, we didn't have time to put together a police committee meeting, and so, both myself and interim chief Nienaber have discussed it, and we would be requesting to fill that position, and we would ask that the council consider it at this meeting. We do recognize that it's a bit out of order, but just due to timeliness and the amount of time it takes for a police officer recruitment, we'd like to get this started immediately if possible. You have anything to add, or?
I agree, that would be my request as well.
Okay,
Yep.
okay, open for discussion. Any questions for interim chief?
Could we chain Jordan to the desk so he can't leave? Can't do that?
I did try slamming my door on him when he was coming. I had a feeling that's what he was trying to, but he got in.
So I'll make a motion to recruit a full-time police officer.
I will second that.
Okay. Motion by Councilmember Batchor, second by Councilmember Hattlestead to begin the recruiting process for a full-time police officer. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried.
How's the background check coming in on?
Good, good. Maybe a week, I would
Okay.
hope it'll be done,
Oh, okay.
so,
Good.
hopefully.
Can we use the same newspaper ads we used last time, or are there
You're
corrections?
sort of updating.
that
under
We
need
the-
to update it?
we're reviewing the, job description, and then we'll adjust the recruitment and postings based on that, but,
I think the sooner we get it out, like I said, the better.
Yep.
Better, yeah.
We get this done.
yep.
So I think last time we had, what, like a two-week open for when it was open? Is that right? Do we remember? It was like
Don't
2 weeks
remember,
or something
but
like
I
that?
mean, I would think 2 weeks
I
would
think
be.
2 weeks
So if we
was-
can do the same,
I think it
just
was
to,
2 weeks.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think 2 weeks is. plenty.
Yeah,
And it gets posted in what?
It would be-
numerous-
yeah, the local, obviously the local paper, we also would do the League of Minnesota Cities, and then Post is gonna be your big one, the Post board, that's where you're gonna get the bulk of the candidates, so.
Okay.
And then if there's any others we can think of,
I can't think of any,
Yeah.
those are the three.
yeah, if you get those,
Important
pretty
ones.
much covered.
Were there any of the applicants from the last time, can we review those or look at those?
I wouldn't recommend that.
No.
I have a question. We probably won't have our new chief hired by then, when we get down to the interview process of the new police officer. But my thinking is that it would be nice if we know he's going to be the chief, to maybe be around during the interviews or not, since he's gonna be working with and for that chief. Or don't we want him to have any say in that matter?
You run into a little bit of risk in that if he has not been, if that position has not been cleared, the minute he would be participating, there could be an argument that he's an employee. And so then in the event that you run into a situation where you could potentially have an employee when you may not want an employee.
So I asked.
That might actually be closer. I think that's something we'll look at. If we're
If-
getting to within a week or two of him
Yes.
starting, I would think it would make sense
Uh-huh.
to hold off on the interview so that he can be the one.
So,
to-
because this guy's gonna be working with
Right.
him.
No, I
Yes.
agree with you.
And it's kinda nice that Scott just started, so when the chief comes in, he could work with both the patrol officers and what he's looking for, and I think he'd have a smoother department.
No,
Everybody would be on the same page.
I think if we're a week or two away from hiring the new chief, I think it would just make sense to just,
To
so
wait with
while we
interviews.
want to hustle with this new officer,
That-
2-week delay wouldn't hurt anything
Yeah.
because of, it would be
To
nice.
involve the
I think
chief.
the new chief should be
I've
involved in the
been thinking
process.
about that ever since I heard
Yep.
about Jordan, and I thought, man, if we could
Yep.
include the new chief, I think he'd appreciate it, and I think it would be a benefit.
I think if we get this to the point where we are ready to interview when he starts, then that's about as fast as we could hope to, fast as we should move it along, I think.
And Scott is or will be shortly on his own.
Very shortly, yeah.
Yep.
So Scott will be ready to go
Yes.
just before Jordan leaves.
Now, that brings up the question, we're gonna be shorthanded again.
Yes.
Has anybody talked to the county about coverage or?
Well, it's only gonna be a few days where you're actually not gonna be shorthanded.
When does he leave?
Because Scott is still with Jordan, so basically there still is only one car on. It's still only like one patrolman on. So
We're not losing anything.
we're not losing anything. Jordan's gonna leave, then Scott will be ready. So it's not gonna be any different
And
than
then
what it has been.
Still have our extra coverage like we've been getting
Yes.
from the county and such, so.
But then we're also getting closer now to the chief, so then there will be two.
Was there a contract with the county and a date on it, or
There was no ending
There's
date,
no
I
end
don't
date
think.
on it, no.
was that what?
Whenever you don't need the county anymore, they're gonna be fine to just step back. I'm confident.
Bruce will send a thank you note. Maybe we'll send one to the county too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions, comments for Chief Nienaber? All right,
Thank you.
You bet.
Yep,
we'll
thanks.
move on
Can I-
to item B, full-time maintenance worker.
Yes. Also, we received a resignation from Trevor in the maintenance worker in the streets department, or the maintenance department, excuse me. And this one, we did have a streets committee meeting already scheduled, and so we were able to discuss that in the streets committee. And again, Kirby and I made the request to refill the position and recruit for that. And so the streets committee has discussed it and would recommend the recruitment. Again, moving forward as quickly as possible.
Using the same job layout
That-
as
well,
before, or,
We are reviewing that job description as well, is just to see if it should be updated or if there's anything else that wants to be reviewed and changed prior to, but we are looking at hopefully being able to post that tomorrow or the next day.
yeah, other than just dates, because I know we just reviewed it and changed a few things, so.
Yeah.
With the changes of the dates and such being
Do you-
made,
Is the advertisement with a date, an ending date to accept applications, or until filled, or don't you do that?
You can do either. Typically in these positions, you tend to get enough applicants
That you-
initially that you don't need to
Okay.
have it. Until filled is typically more in those positions which are very difficult to find applicants. So you wanna kinda leave leave it open. So for these two positions, I don't think that you would necessarily need to do that. You could have a more finalized or a formal closing date.
Closing date, right.
And this one as well, we had discussed doing a 2 week.
2 week.
But
And
we're gonna do a much
broader.
larger and broader,
Okay.
posting. There were
Okay.
very, very few applicants last time, so Kirby's thinking by expanding that, we can get a different pool of applicants and a
Okay.
larger pool.
Sounds good. I'll make a motion to, post that full-time maintenance worker.
I'll second it.
Motion by Councilmember Batchor, second by Councilmember Yashewski to post the full-time maintenance worker position. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. And then lastly, the seasonal worker maintenance department.
Yeah, this was kind of talked about at the Streets Committee meeting, but I think based on the conversation of Streets Committee following that, Kirby and I discussed the idea of hiring just a temporary seasonal worker for the fall while there is this vacancy. There's several projects that he's looking at doing, most of them involving trees and Christmas lights, as we discussed at the committee. And he had another seasonal in line, and that fell through. And then he had been looking at increasing the current part-time's hours, but then we run into benefit and health, having to provide health insurance. And so we would not want to look at that, and so we thought if we could just bring on somebody for just this little interim, that may be helpful, so that he can keep up with the fall stuff, and as we talked about, most of the items, while they may not need a skilled position, just having another set of eyes present during some of these activities would be helpful.
How many hours are we looking for?
I think, we'd probably be looking at around that 20 to 25, again, we'd wanna stay underneath.
Now that school's starting, would a co-op position be enough or not?
For 2 months.
For the kids,
Yeah,
can they do that?
I don't know.
This
No, they
seasonal
can't.
worker wouldn't have to have a CDL, correct? Or
Correct.
would he?
No, not for this, cause
Okay,
Kirby would look at, he could do the functions as such that it wouldn't be required.
what would the age
on.
require, do they have to be 18?
18.
Yeah,
Oh,
you'd
so
probably
we
wanna
eliminate
be,
co-op
you'd
workers.
probably wanna be
Well, not all
18
of them,
just to be.
Most.
Maybe we get a couple jailbirds out of the county come work. Each one works a day a week.
Depending on what kind of, is there an option to maybe look at, bringing in a lawn mowing crew and using our seasonal lawnmower to do this kind of hands-on work, and maybe hire somebody to
Yep.
cut the lawn for the rest of
More
the
of a-
season, maybe?
Yep, contract out some
Do a
of the
contract
functions.
for that
Mhm.
instead?
Yep,
I mean,
that would
it
be
probably
another
end up,
option.
end up costing us a little bit more, but you know what? We could probably have that, start happening like now or very soon versus trying to hire somebody for a part-time position, which would be very, very difficult, I believe, to fill.
For somebody for 6 or 8 weeks.
Oh, if they know it's gonna be 2 months and that's it,
Nobody's gonna get off.
part-time,
Anybody on unemployment's not gonna get off unemployment for a 6-week job. And in 6, 8 weeks, we'll have the other employee here.
well, and I mean, we could keep the other one, the lawnmower longer
Yeah.
potentially or whatever into the
Yes.
fall, and if we had the lawn contracted out, and well, depending on the weather, maybe we won't have to cut lawn that long.
Let's hope.
Mm-hmm.
I cut it in November every year.
Well, I mean, I guess that's a gamble that you don't know what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
However, I mean,
Yeah.
Okay.
the way I
good
look
point.
at it or whatever, I mean, maybe that would be something if we can look into that real quick.
Yes, yep, yeah, cause I know, Kenny had indicated he's got some flexibility as far as
Mhm.
what functions he'd be willing to do, so, if we would have somebody offset the lawn mowing, he could do some of those
Yeah.
other
He's been
activities.
What
a good
Kirby
employee,
needs,
so
Trooper.
Kenny could fill.
he's
Correct.
been
Mhm.
he's been a good one.
Yep,
It's just a suggestion, so if that works.
Yep. yeah, we can certainly
some
look into
pricing.
that.
And
Okay,
then, would it be, something that would be up to, Kirby to make that final decision, or if we put it in the hands of, our city administrator, to make that call, if it's within a reasonable cost, or I don't wanna wait 2 weeks, come back to a council meeting to make a decision.
agree.
Oh, right.
No.
I would rather get him on board as soon as we could possibly get him on board so that he has that help like now.
I'm fine with Liza and Kirby
Yeah.
doing it after they see what the estimates are, cause I think we might be shocked at what the commercial lawn mowing's gonna cost us. I really do.
Well, there's other ones out there, and don't we have to kinda throw that
Pardon me,
out?
Laura.
We wouldn't necessarily, just because it's gonna be such a minimal amount in the contracting world. But, yeah, I think, we could, again, just pop something in the paper, pop something up on the website and on the Facebook and stuff, just indicating that, if somebody's interested, to contact us by a certain date. And
Because we also contracted for spraying this spring,
Yeah.
correct? So, I mean, I'm just thinking, that was kind of expensive as well, but
It
we
worked.
needed hands.
Yeah.
It worked.
Yep. We can certainly
And
do-
yes, Laura. And
Yes.
Yeah, we all heard the Liza.
I apologize for
No,
that,
that's
dear.
fine.
Okay, is that something, we need a motion on that too, I
Yeah.
imagine, to advertise for a seasonal worker in the maintenance department? Anyone?
Make a motion that we
Yeah.
advertise for a seasonal worker. The way that one
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
No, I don't think that's what
That's opposite to what
that's
you
the
said.
opposite of what I said.
She was talking,
Looking for contractors.
looking for a contract
Yeah.
mower, so Kenny, our seasonal employee, could work with Kirby until we get the next city maintenance worker. Am I correct?
That's right.
I think we would want a motion directing the interim city administrator and maintenance supervisor to contract
For lawn service.
for lawn services on a temporary
Then I
basis.
would make a motion.
Wait a minute,
Whoop, whoop, we got a motion already.
Okay,
let me withdraw my motion.
Let's start over. What was the intent here?
Do we know what it would cost to hire a contract?
that's
We're
what
leaving that up to them.
Laura's gonna check out for us. Because, no, we don't know, and it could be expensive. I think it's gonna be more than any of us even realize.
Oh, yeah, it's gonna be
A phenomenal amount of money.
$50 an hour, $40 an
Yeah, you
hour.
think you get one for 50? I mean, I'm all for checking it out,
Yeah.
because it's the end of the season, and for some of these guys to maybe keep their guys working a little longer, they might be willing to give, I don't know. I doubt it, but I don't have a problem checking it out. But I agree, the price will probably shock us.
It is. I'm,
So what direction do we want to move here with action?
Yeah.
I hear flying all over the place.
Well, I'll throw a motion out there to have the city administrator and the and Kirby to look into contracting lawn mowing service for temporary basis.
Second, anyone?
I'll second it again.
Okay.
And then what? They're gonna look into it and then come back next
They'd have to
meeting,
come
or
back to with us.
Should we put a cap on it? And that way, if it comes below that cap, till the end of the mowing season, then they can just go ahead and, or do we wanna wait 2 weeks before we get somebody?
how many hours are we spending a week mowing lawns now?
Yeah, it's,
60?
30,
Maybe
yeah,
60?
probably 60 in the 2 weeks.
Could be $3,000 a week.
Typically, what I've seen is when you do this, if you go more so with what you want as the outcome and then give some flexibility to that contractor, you'll end up with a lot better rates than if you are pretty specific. So if, what I would say is we would identify exactly what those sites are that we are going to be looking for quotes. I would have them bid it out individually, whether it be the individual parks, the community center, that type of stuff, and as a whole. And then you can kind of pick and choose your low, and that's
maybe still have Kenny mow some of those
Yep.
that would maybe be really way too expensive.
yeah, Kenny could offset some of it. I mean, Kirby's willing to offset it, but I look at it, do we want to be having Kirby mowing? Is that a good use of Kirby's time?
Probably not.
No.
Cause then we can find out exactly what it costs us per hour.
Yeah.
To,
What are we paying the temporary lawnmowers now?
I was gonna say, I think 11.
11 or $12
I think it was
Sounds
an hour.
Like it was
It was
11.
11,
It was
11,
11, yeah.
Okay, so then we aren't moving in the direction of giving authority to advertising for a seasonal worker at this time. This time, we are giving direction to get quotes on hiring contract lawn mowing.
Contracting for lawn.
Okay?
Yep.
Motion by Batchor, second by Yashewski to that motion. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. Okay. Then we will move on to item 11, street reconstruction, tree replacement, Brinkman property.
This has been talked about at several council meetings, kind of at the end of the meeting, where it wasn't an actual action item. At the last council meeting, it was asked that this get put on the agenda so that there could be some discussion. There's, the streets committee discussed it as well, talking about whether or not the city would actually do the replacement of the trees, or if it would make more sense to go forward and just do a reimbursement based on it, and then work up some type of waiver, so that then the city would be, once they would get reimbursed, then the city would be free and clear of this type of, if anything were to happen, so. Those were the options that were talked about at street committee and has been kind of talked about on an informal basis in council meetings prior to this, and so we just wanted to have some action to resolve it.
Was there a dollar amount that was thrown out there for the reimbursement?
Yeah, it was what was the estimate, 500 or 600 per tree planted?
At the time, they were like, for autumn blaze maple, a 3-inch was under $300 and $220 to deliver it and plant it.
Did they say was that price good still this fall? Did they say was that price still good this fall?
I don't know.
So we can't hardly authorize a dollar.
Well, if there were, that was a 3-inch, a 2.5-inch were about the same price. Or if we went out to the Conkey Brothers auction on Saturday, probably get one for $100. But
Yeah, it was, the 1.5 to 3 inches was $190 to just over $335.
Plus delivery.
And then, to have them deliver and plant with the 1 year would cost $220 per tree.
That's a 1-year guarantee then. Okay.
But that delivering cost is gonna cost us no matter which way we go.
Right.